Good morning or afternoon to everyone, depending on where you're sitting. And welcome to our webinar. We're delighted you're here. We hope you have a great cup of coffee in front of you or a delicious sandwich or whatever time zone you're in that you want to be joining us with. We're happy that you're here. We're going to give some folks about a minute or two to join in. We've got many people signed up, and then we'll start with introductions and we'll jump into the topic. And for those of you just joining, hello. We are glad you're here. We're going to start in about 1 minute, and we invite you to settle in with whatever your warm or cold beverage is of choice, depending on what part of the country you're in. We know there are lots of you from all over the country. We're really delighted that you're joining us today. Okay, we've got a lot to cover, so we're going to get going. We're going to do introductions in a moment. I just want to start by saying from a sort of logistics perspective that we are going to encourage questions, and we're going to encourage you to use the chat to do that. We'll be taking questions at the end. We have about 40 minutes worth of content, and then we'll look forward to answering your questions. I've got a colleague, my colleague Romaine, who is monitoring the chat for questions, and then my colleague Bonnie is there in the chat if you're having any technical issues. But for now, I'm going to start by introducing those of us who are going to be doing most of the talking during this webinar. So my name is Sarah Moore, and I'm a partner and director of brand strategy at Mission Minded. I'm really delighted to welcome you here today. I've been at Mission Minded for about 12 years, leading the strategy practice, but I think what's also relevant for today's discussion is I sit on a board, and we are in the midst of the quiet phase of a capital campaign. And so I have a lot of heart for fundraising communications, both on a personal and a professional level. And Rehana, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself and maybe talk a little bit about what made you reach out to hire Mission Minded to do the work that you and I did together that we're going to talk about today.
Sure. So hi, everyone. So nice to be with you this morning. My name is Rehana Abbas, and I am the Chief Philanthropy Officer at the San Francisco Foundation. When I started at the San Francisco Foundation, the foundation had already decided that they'd like to do a campaign, in part because we were about to celebrate our 75th anniversary, and realized we've never done a large fundraising campaign before. And so I realized that we needed some help with messaging specifically to donors. We have an amazing marketing and communications team, but we hadn't done this kind of marketing and communications before. And so I had been fortunate enough to work with Mission Minded and my last organization, the Oakland Museum of California, on a successful campaign there. And we reached out to Mission Minded and were fortunate enough to work together again.
Thanks, Rehana, and thanks for the opportunity to work with you again. That was always a pleasure. I'm going to just share a little bit more about Mission Minded so you know who's leading this webinar and sort of what our area of expertise are. So Mission Minded is a strategy and creative firm, and we help good causes have greater impact. And we believe that organizations that make our world better really need to be unapologetically bold in what they're doing. So every day we're asking one simple question. We ask, what if? And we find opportunities for you to break the mold and fire up your supporters, because we know when your community is united by magnetic ideas, they will stop at nothing to help you achieve the extraordinary results that you deserve. And honestly, that's what we're talking about in fundraising communications, is how to do this in a way that is both equitable and brings people into the conversation in a way that helps you succeed. We do this, as Rehana said, we do this for several organizations, and I think just a couple I'll touch on today to just give you some context for why we're here to talk about fundraising communications. The first I'm going to share is some recent work that we did for the University of British Columbia, who was setting a very ambitious $250 million capital campaign goal to build a really interesting interdisciplinary building that extended their rich history of work, which was really bringing in different disciplines and departments and thinking as one. So doing that in a different way required different language to invite people into that conversation. Beyond fundraising communications, we do a lot of work in print and digital, all sorts of brand work. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. Bonnie, you can go ahead and advance a couple of slides. Another campaign I want to just talk about is the Think Forward campaign. This was for the Curtis School. The Curtis School is in Los Angeles. This was a $22 million campaign that was for a 25-year campus master plan initiative. So they really needed to create some fundraising communications that allowed them to hold something for quite some time that would allow them to address different initiatives as they came up, ones they probably couldn't even imagine with a 25-year master plan. And then finally, I'm just going to talk a little bit about Wesleyan University, which is a private liberal arts college in Connecticut. They were embarking on a $600 million campaign, and giving amongst their alumni had been down in recent years. One of the things we knew about their brand was that they're a bit of an anti-establishment group who tends to be a little cynical about traditional and institutional fundraising initiatives. So we worked closely with them to leverage their brand personality and come up with a "this is not a campaign" fundraising campaign. And in fact, that really resonated amongst the values of their audience. And I'm happy to report that 6 months into their phase, they're already at 65% of their goal. So these are just some opportunities we've had to talk about fundraising communications and work alongside our clients doing those. So let's talk about how to think about what's important to your organization and your values and how to do that in an equitable and inviting way. So here's what we're going to cover today. We're going to talk about what's been happening and why it's problematic and time to make a shift, and what that shift or communication shift needs to look like in your communications as you're thinking about fundraising. And then we're going to talk about our wonderful friends at the San Francisco Foundation and the solution and how you can apply that to your own work today. For those who might be joining a little later, I just want to remind you that we will be taking questions at the end of this presentation. We encourage you to put them in the chat. We'll be curating those as we go, and then we'll have hopefully a really fruitful discussion at the end of this as well. Okay, so let's talk about the old way and why it's problematic. So often we are raising money to address needs and gaps that are created by systems of inequity, and yet sometimes our communications are not, in fact, equitable. So I think this quote from CCF, which is a movement started by fundraising leaders of color who want to transform these systems. And if any of you know Vu Le, who's quite a well-known blogger in the space around philanthropy, he's a guiding mentor of theirs. And I think one of the things that really strikes me in this is this second sentence. While we know we are in a really large industry, the practices, theories, and foundation of modern philanthropy and fundraising often ignore the ways in which the industry perpetuates the very injustices that the nonprofit sector wishes to end. So thinking about what we're doing and are we doing it in an equitable way is as important as the mission-driven work that you're doing. So to think about how we got here, I think it's important to think about the old way for a little bit. And I want to acknowledge right up front that this old way is in fact very well-intentioned, meaning we created systems of philanthropy to support one another, right? So we know it came from a place of goodness, but it's created some power structures that are honestly just troubling in 2024, right? For many years, fundraising for nonprofits were seen as charitable gifts to help the poor and disenfranchised. And note, I am using that language in particular, right? That's how charitable gifts were seen. There's a concept in charitable gifts around the idea of noblesse oblige, if you've ever heard that phrase before. That's a French translation that literally means nobility is obligated. So this kind of infers responsibility of privileged people to act with generosity and nobility towards those less privileged. So if you think about the origins of philanthropy, you're starting with a really interesting power structure right from the get-go. And so we can see how we have created some sense of those who are privileged taking care of those who are less privileged, and sort of all the issues that that creates. Here's why it's problematic, right? You may be actually working in issues that are very much rooted in equity, and yet this practice is not. So we really want to think about how do we address this differently. We also think about, often when we are doing a major fundraising campaign, we think about the fact that we often will talk to those who we want to engage early on, right? We talk about a quiet phase. And in fact, in many ways, that quiet phase right off the bat is very exclusive. Rehana, you had a point about that I'd love you to share with folks.
Sure. So while I'm at an organization that is 100% focused on racial equity, we are in a quiet phase of a campaign. And so I said to Sarah when we were looking through this content, I think that there is a practicality as fundraisers around a quiet phase that you have to start testing your messages on the people who are actually going to make gifts. Sometimes before you are, putting out a big goal. I think more and more we're seeing that people are entering into campaigns with a little bit of a fuzzy goal, especially just this time feels a little uncertain. And so the quiet phase is a way to sort of test the messages and see how it's going, and to really refine your goal kind of as you're starting out in your campaign. So I think to that, I would say there's a practicality as fundraisers really need that quiet phase. But I think, are you positioning that quiet phase as sort of like the exclusive get in first? That's different than using it more as a tool to set up successful fundraising.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. I really appreciate that nuance too, because there are things in here that we know there are practices that need to continue, but it's the consciousness and the way with which we approach those practices that I think make all the difference. Finally, I just want to talk about the fact that, and Bonnie, you can stand that last slide for a moment. The idea that we've trained donors to think that they're what matters most, right? And I will say Mission Minded was guilty of this, right? We used words like, you made this possible. Thank you. We couldn't have done it without you. And by the way, we couldn't have done it without you, right? We're not even talking about our clients. Like it's all about us, and we couldn't have done it without you. What about our clients who are actually doing the work in the mission-driven organizations that we're in? So really thinking about some of the structures that we've put in place that we really need to question, or at least bring a consciousness to. If for no other reason, that it's incredibly important to be thinking about this for the long-term health and sustainability of your organization. And now we can move to the next slide. And that's really thinking about Gen Z and millennials who are coming up. Bonnie, you want to move ahead to the next slide, please? Thanks very much. Because they're thinking very, very differently than previous donors and previous generations. And so we really want to be moving towards more equity in communications, if for no other reason than to think about them and the demands they are going to make of the organizations that they choose to support. They're looking at all these kinds of things: values alignment and authenticity and transparency and peer influence. The list really, really goes on and on. And I think one way to think about this is to ask yourself, did your parents or your grandparents ever think about the values or the practices of the Red Cross, right? Who they served, who they didn't, when they served them, and why, right? Nope. Generally, parents were happy to support an organization that they thought was doing good work. And that's very, very different in the Gen Z and millennial cohorts. They ask much harder questions. They really examine the choices they make. They have a set of values. They want to make sure that you align with those values. So again, bringing an equity lens to your fundraising practices and your communications is really important, if not just for today and for today's efforts, but for the long-term health and sustainability of your organization. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the shift that we see that's really needed as we move into this new world order, if you will. And we think about it as fundraising with an equity lens, changing how we must communicate. And so if we're talking about equity, Bonnie, you can jump ahead 2 slides, please. We need a shared definition of what equity is. So let's advance to the next slide. And I'm going to use this definition. I recognize there are many definitions out there. We use this framework by our colleague Tierney Yates, who is our DEI advisor at Mission Minded. He has a consulting organization called Little Light, and we've benefited from working with them for many years. We think about equity as the unprecedented treatment, access, opportunity, and advancement for all people. And all of that is in support to achieving their individual success. Now, I recognize there are many, many nuances of definitions around equity, but I wanted to have a shared one for purposes of our discussion. And again, for those of you who may be joining late, I want to encourage you, if you have questions, to please put them in the chat, and we'll be addressing questions at the end of this presentation. So if we're going to talk about equity, one of the things we have to recognize is, starting with our own donors, that equity really starts with where our donors are, just as we would with those whose journey we're supporting, whether it's our clients. We have to meet our donors where we are. And we also have to recognize that not everyone is in the same place when it comes to understanding equity. And I think in particular, for those of you who might be working in foundations or community foundations, we think about legacy fund holders whose family may have held a fund in your organization for many, many years. Or for those of you not in the foundation space, thinking about longtime donors. And is this something that a family has done for years and years without too much thinking about it? So really, Rehana, I'd love it if you would talk a little bit about where some of your donors were when you started your fundraising campaign and how you thought about bringing them along on this.
Sure. So when we started our campaign, we just as Sarah said, we have donors who've been with us for a really long time. And on my team, we work with about 550 donor advised funds. And some of those donor advised funds have been with us for generations at this point, and then others are brand new. And the foundation, the San Francisco Foundation, really articulated our commitment to racial equity about 8 or 9 years ago. And so some of the people who've joined us in the last, say, 5 years, they're actually seeking us out because of the commitment to racial equity that we have. But for others, it's, they're all at different points of their journey. And so, one of the things I think we found is that we've been quite successful fundraising from other institutional partners. And it's interesting to think about that, like another foundation who's working in systems change at scale is going to understand some of this language and these challenges in a different way than individual donors who maybe aren't working in that space. And maybe, for example, are funding more direct service instead of systems change. So it's definitely, we really had to think about, like, who are we talking to and why? And I think many of us that work in philanthropy know that there's a lot of jargon. And so cutting through the jargon was another really big piece to say what we mean. When, for example, we often will say things like, we go all in on, like, what does that mean to someone? We use every lever at our disposal. What lever? So really naming these things was important as we started thinking about how we're going to bring donors along.
Yeah, thank you, Rehana. And one of the things we were just talking about earlier this morning was this idea that you do often need many frequent touch points, right? That this is an educational journey. And you said yourself that for some of your longtime donors, this has required multiple conversations or communications that help bring them along in this journey.
Yeah, I was telling Sarah earlier, I think we sort of thought that more donors were understanding around what we say when we mean systems change and systems change at scale. And that we've ended up finding that we need a lot more conversations about what that really means and kind of what the nuts and bolts of that are and how we're making change. And systems change is it's a long road. And so donors also can often be trained to say, I gave you $100,000 6 months ago. What have you done with it? Well, when you're trying to, change homelessness and create economic opportunity for people in the Bay Area, it doesn't get fixed in 6 months, and so that's also been a challenge in figuring out how we're going to talk to people about the impact of the change in a way that they might not be used to.
Yeah, thank you. And so that's part of the shift, right? Is thinking about equity in a new way and thinking about it from the perspective of your donors. And then secondly is really as equally as important is this shift, which some of you may be familiar with, this shift from savior to ally. And that's something that's had a lot of press written about it recently. I'm going to give you an example of something. What does it mean to shift from savior to ally? And what we mean by that, and Bonnie, you can advance ahead, is really thinking about us being the solution to us being a partner in the work. And so I think the best example to use here is our work that we did for our client, the Rhodes Trust. And the Rhodes Trust came to us because they had a problem. As a Center for Scholarship and Study based at Oxford University in England, they undertook a significant fundraising campaign to expand their scholarship globally after 125 years. This meant bringing in donors from all over the world, including in countries in sub-Saharan Africa, where, quite frankly, Cecil Rhodes, their founder, had made his money as a notorious colonizer. So there was a very uncomfortable paradox about trying to expand globally and go to donors globally in the very countries in which this generational wealth had been made under questionable circumstances. And Mission Minded really worked deeply with the Rhodes Trust to understand that this reality could not be hidden from donors, and in fact, needed to be addressed head on. Bringing others on the journey with you sometimes means that you need to share your own vulnerability or share your own learning journey. So as you're thinking about your role in equity, it's also demonstrating to others that growth mindset. I'm going to read just a little bit of the Rhodes Trust case for support because I think it helps demonstrate how we helped Rhodes ask donors to walk with them. So this is from the case for support. In that spirit, we acknowledge that racism and other forms of exclusion have played a significant role in the history of the Rhodes Trust. While we've moved beyond our past in important ways, much more is required. Our mission and complicated legacy drive us to play a proactive role in this work. We embrace the opportunity to continuously improve and to enhance our ability to develop leaders who will make positive change. This means engaging more fully, critically, and honestly in our history and inviting you to join in that work. And so really saying, here's the big picture that we see, and here's how you can walk with us in support of others who we want to become global leaders. So thinking about that shift from being the savior who bestows these benevolent scholarships upon folks to really admitting your own humility and walking with both your those that you're serving and your donors. I think it's one way to walk through this shift with grace. Here's a couple of other things that we think about as we think about shifting your perceptions in communication. Said simply, we want to move from language that are things like, you made this possible, to the opportunity to be an ally to someone else. So Bonnie, you can start popping these up, please, if you will. 4 really big shifts, thinking about stories of victimization to stories of strength. And what I mean by that is, let's go backwards a little bit. Thanks. From stories of victimization to stories of strengths means instead of talking about people and how they were down on their luck and our organization came in and really helped make it better, start from a strengths-based perspective of the beautiful individual strength of these individuals that you're supporting. And there might have been hurdles in their way, but how they, along with support from you, were able to overcome those hurdles. Also moving in your communications from testimonials, you often see, here's why we give to this organization, right? Which is, again, all about the donor, to shifting to spotlights on those doing the actual work to whom you're an ally. And then finally, because everything is communications, really thinking about what does it mean to name buildings and programs after donors? Like, what are we saying about the power structure there? That is a communications choice we're making. So what are the opportunities to shift perceptions and communications from it's all about these wonderful donors to something else that's probably a little more in line with your mission? Rehana, do you want to share that story that you shared with me yesterday that I loved about thinking about this a little bit?
Oh, about building them programs. Yeah. So I will say this is one that this point is one that I'm very passionate about because I spent most of my career working in museums. And if any of you have ever been to a museum, you know that there's names all over the walls. So I really don't believe that we should continue that practice for a number of reasons. Namely, because often those are the really big gifts that qualify you to be able to put your name on the wall, like on a gallery at a museum. And oftentimes those, that level of gift requires some multi-generations of wealth creation. And not everyone in this country has been afforded the opportunity to create generational wealth because of systemic racism. So I really believe we should not be naming buildings and programs often too. But so there's a couple of interesting projects that are happening in San Francisco right now where people are there. There's one project called India Basin. It's a kind of park and cultural center in the Bayview in San Francisco, and they sourced from the community ideas around people they would like to honor. And then if you're a large donor to that project, you can pick from that sourced list of community honorees to name the spaces. So I think that's just a really wonderful creative example of how it's centering the community and the community heroes in naming opportunities. So
yeah, thanks for that. Really just different ways to approach what, you had said it before, there are the operational things you must do as someone who's working in philanthropy, but there are creative ways to solve for issues around communications and signals that can be more equity based. So thanks for sharing that. I love that. So in thinking about this shift, we really want to start talking about what do we do about this? How do we make this better? How can you start right now thinking about things differently for your organization in a way that helps shift the narrative into a way that is more equitable? And Monty, I'm going to ask you to jump ahead 2 slides, please. So we wanted to do this in a way, and I want to say, I know that not all of this is easy, but I want you to have 3 takeaways that you can really start with to begin this shift in your organization, questions and activities and things that you can ask. We're going to go through each of these in more detail, but the first is to really see your donors through a values lens and not a demographic one. And Bonnie, you can go ahead and populate all 3 of these points up here so that folks can follow along with us. I'm going to talk a little bit more about each of these, as I said, but the first is to stop thinking about your donors as major donor, legacy donor, whatever kind of donor, but really start thinking about them in terms of who they are and what they value. Okay, now we've jumped a little too far ahead. Can you go back 1, please? I'm going to ask you to go backwards. 1 more slide. Thank you very much. Okay. So the first is to see your donors through a values lens. The second is to educate them in your role in equity. So Rehana and I have been talking a little bit about this today, right? The Cecil Rhodes example I gave you, some of the examples that Rehana gave you for San Francisco Foundation, to really bring them into this conversation, to recognize that we're all on a learning journey. You may be further ahead on the learning journey than your donors, and that's okay. Part of inviting them into this is inviting them into the learning that you've done to date and inviting them to join you in that learning. And then finally, helping them advance the narrative for your organization and for the sector. And by that, I mean giving them the tools they need to really help be great ambassadors, both of your role in a more equitable world in line with your mission, and also for the world at large. And we'll talk a little bit through a case study with the San Francisco Foundation to help you see one of the ways that San Francisco Foundation was able to do that. Okay. Rehana, let's talk a little bit about sort of level setting for San Francisco Foundation and where you all were. And Bonnie, I'm going to ask you to advance to the next slide, and we'll sort of talk about the work that we did with San Francisco Foundation and how we applied these 3 ideas.
Sure. So for a little background, so as I mentioned, the foundation was approaching its 75th anniversary year, and we wanted to do a fundraising campaign. The reason we needed to do a fundraising campaign is really that, so when you think about a community foundation, if you're one like the San Francisco Foundation, where you're lucky enough to have an endowment, sort of have 2 parts of our business. One part is working with donor advised fund holders, and then the other part is grant making through our own endowment. However, we have kind of taken on this third, we call it like the third leg of the stool of policy work. So, what was realized is that in order to really create system level change, we needed, in addition to the grant making, to be a coalition builder. We needed to work on shifting public narrative, sometimes lobbying, getting bills, like helping, get bills passed through legislation, both locally and statewide. And so we started doing more and more of this work, especially around housing. And what we realized is that we need a different model in order to have funds to support that kind of work. And so we really wanted to start raising money for us to do more of that. And we hadn't really fundraised in that way before. The model that we exist in is that we take fees from donor advised funds, and then also part of our endowment supports our operating budget, but it doesn't leave a lot of room for that those innovation dollars to be able to do that policy work. So that is not easy to explain to people, frankly. And so we had really struggled to articulate the need for that with specifically, I would say with our individual donors. Again, institutional funders, they kind of got it quicker, but with our individual donors, it was a challenge. And then really this kind of role that we do, it's like we talk interestingly about like the way that we lead. We don't lead from the front often. We use our influence to be able to call the right stakeholders to the table, but then we really let our grantee partners, our community members sort of lead the conversations around what are going to be the best path forward for those communities. And so we wanted to be able to do that more and more. I think the San Francisco Foundation is so trusted in our community that we're not bringing like a loaded agenda to those conversations. So people are really willing to partner with us in entering those conversations.
Yeah, great. So it was a complicated issue, to be fair, and we've talked about how we needed to really think deeply about both the audiences and how to approach that, because there were many moving parts to this. And Rehana, you and I have talked about the fact that because this is systemic based work, it required an even finer lens on really thinking deeply about people's values.
Sure. And I'll add one other quick thing too. One thing that I actually would say we've realized more, and we realized it while we were doing the work with Mission Minded, but also it's kind of the point has been honed more and more as we've been going along. The San Francisco Foundation looks at really kind of approaches, well, I'll start with donors. Oftentimes donors think about their funding in buckets, right? I fund arts and culture, education, I fund, a scholarship program, I fund environmental issues, and I fund racial equity. And they look at racial equity as a bucket. Now, at the San Francisco Foundation, we might fund all of those things, but we do it all through a lens of racial equity. And that difference between a bucket versus the lens was something that we've really found out as we've gone and talked to our donors. They don't understand that. Like, so when they hear our commitment to racial equity, they think that is meaning we're just funding racial equity and we are not funding all these other things, which is not true. So they're not fully seeing even like the systemic impact we're having across multiple parts of the nonprofit sector. So that also was a really different, we realized how disconnected we were from how our donors were thinking about funding racial equity versus how we were thinking about funding racial equity.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a great example of why this thinking about values-based audiences was really helpful in this work, because it was aligning with values and not with around buckets, right? So let's talk about values-based audiences. And I recognize we're working on issues in the chat for getting Q&A, and I thank you all for your patience on that. And I'm hoping that we've all figured out now how to throw our questions into the chat. And as I said, we'll get to those at the end of this content. So Bonnie, I'm going to ask you to jump ahead 2 slides. The first thing we talked about sort of in this easy as 1, 2, 3 is thinking about values-based audiences. And what we mean by that is really unpacking and articulating the values your organization and your donors share. So as Rehana was saying, less thinking about like, here's my arts donors and here's my housing donors, and really thinking about what are the overall values that connect them to the work that we're doing. So part of the work that we did at Mission Minded alongside San Francisco Foundation was thinking deeply about who their audiences were. And in our work together, we developed personas of people who care about the values and their things that they are motivated by. And we really thought about them as people and not as part of a wealth screener, if you will. And then the third thing you want to do is connect their values to yours in your communications. So when we do this work, and when we did this work with San Francisco Foundation, we spend part of a day together thinking deeply about these audiences. What are their values? Who influences them? What do they want their legacy to be? What do we want from them? What do they want from us? What do they think the opportunities are when they align with us? And I would encourage you, as you're thinking about your donors in your campaigns, to be doing the same kind of work. Stop segmenting them through demographics and really think deeply about what motivates them and really what do they value and how do those values connect to the values and the mission-driven work that we're doing. Here's how we identified the audiences for San Francisco Foundation. And Bonnie, you can jump ahead to the next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about this, and then Rehana, I'm going to invite you to add any context that you want. But we really thought about these as real people. So we thought about 4 different kinds of values alignment for people who might want to join the San Francisco Foundation campaign. Whether it was San Francisco, who was a longtime legacy donor, who really wanted to make sure that they were leaving the Bay Area in a way that created hope for what is, has been a difficult time in San Francisco. I don't need to go into that with folks too much. But Evolving Evelyn was someone who was really kind of coming into understanding equity, or maybe understood that they wanted to understand more about equity and that they needed to be in a place where they could learn with an organization doing the kind of work that the foundation, San Francisco Foundation, is doing. Nat Newby was someone who maybe was new to the Bay Area and really wanted to demonstrate their opportunity to have a leadership role in the community. And Bay Area Betty was someone who really was motivated to make the Bay Area more equitable, who really had that heart for the work that the San Francisco Foundation was doing. I want to add here that we, as a company, Mission Minded, did this work a year ago, and even in our work in trying to be more equitable and our communications, I would say we would do this differently a year later. You can see that there are names here that identify gender and to some degree race. And so if I were to rewrite these today, I would probably take those words out and make them more about their values. So I might refer to San Francisco as the 49ers, or I might refer to Evolving Evelyn as the evolutionists, and so on. So we're really doing our work on a continuous growth path to think about really how do we align with values and not with any particular individual demography. Rehana, anything you want to add there?
I think that it was really helpful for us to think about it in this way and kind of truly identify who are the people we want to talk to for this campaign. I think that was really important. Also, like, not everyone is going to be your target audience for any particular campaign. So it was important for us to really think about that and like, who did we need to reach in order for this campaign to be successful? And so then having these different personas enabled us to then craft the messages that would actually speak to all of these people through one unified set of messaging materials.
Great. Okay, thanks. Yeah, we've got some great questions coming up, so we're going to go through this really quickly and make sure that we have time to answer all those questions. So, second piece we're going to then talk about is, after you've identified through a values audience, how do you educate about your organization's role in equity? And Bonnie, I'm going to ask you to move forward 2 slides, please. Part of what we do in our work with San Francisco Foundation is make sure we're doing our research and really understanding the opportunities to talk about how to align and find what is distinctive about San Francisco Foundation and the role that they can play with their donors in a way that feels valued aligned. And these 2, I'd say, while we did a lot of work, these 2 quotes really stuck out for us in our research about the idea that no matter how much money any of us gives, we can't individually change the game, but as part of San Francisco Foundation, we can. And then the second piece of this was that San Francisco Foundation is really unafraid to take stands on issues, while other community foundations are slow. They are bold and they use their position to galvanize their work. And part of good fundraising communications at Mission Minded is having a clear strategy of what we want to communicate. So then when we go off and write messages and cases for support and language that board members can use, we make sure that we're aligning on a strategy that takes the best of San Francisco Foundation and merges that and its value system with those of their donors. The way we do that, and we can jump ahead to the next slide, is we have a three-part sort of formula, if you will, for a great case. And that is really understanding why now, what's the emotional hook, and what are the rational reasons to believe. And I think, I'll wait till the next slide, but Rehana, we were talking about this yesterday. There's something I thought you said that was really interesting. So Bonnie, let's jump to the next slide and say, here's what this looked like for educating donors about San Francisco Foundation and its unique role. And this was our strategy. The urgency was seizing the momentum and unifying our power to uproot systemic barriers to equity and inclusion. And part of that was having emotion as part of this dynamic collective action. I feel effective and optimistic. That's how we wanted people to feel when they engaged with donor communications. And thirdly, what was the rationale? There's wonderful rationale at San Francisco Foundation. They've been around for 75 years. They have region-wide influence. They're a really effective bridge to a more equitable Bay Area. What we often see in fundraising communications is an organization has 2 out of 3 of these. So they might have some great rationale and a real sense of urgency, or some great rationale and some heart-stringing emotion. But we really believe it takes all 3 of these to make an effective communication strategy for fundraising. Rehana, do you want to just talk quickly to the piece we were talking about yesterday about equity and your team and what it took?
Sure. Yeah. So it was really interesting. So when we did, and actually a couple of slides from now, also it talks about how we advance the narrative. But so we were doing we did a workshop with a lot of our staff. And I remember hearing like an audible gasp in the room when Mission Minded was like, we hate to break it to you, but racial equity is not your differentiator. Because at one point in time, because San Francisco Foundation made this really deep commitment to racial equity, it was a bit of a differentiator for us from other community foundations. But after the murder of George Floyd in 2020, many philanthropic entities, pivoted to, trying to shift systems that are, not equitable. And so it was funny looking at, East Bay Community Foundation, Marin Community Foundation, Silicon Valley Community Foundation, all these others. When you read their kind of headlines on their website, they sounded just like we did. And so that was a really big shift for people at my organization to realize that like racial equity wasn't going to be the thing that sets us apart in this campaign. And so it was really important to think about like, how are we going to talk about what will set us apart? And so we worked really hard to kind of bring people along on that, because again, I mean, it was like the audible gasp in the room when it was like, this isn't going to be the thing. So then that partnership with Mission Minded and getting so many perspectives of different people was essential so that we could figure out really what that, what was going to be the thing that sets us apart for this campaign.
Yeah, I remember we put that slide up with all the different headlines of each of those organizations. And it really was a sobering moment to realize, you have to dig deeper to find what is your unique proposition. And that's why I'm glad we were able to do that work together. So we created this strategy. And then the third piece is, so again, you can see how we're educating our donors about bringing them along on our journey and inviting them to join us. And then how do we get, as the third piece of it, how do we get them to advance the narrative? And Bonnie, you can probably jump ahead 2 slides here. And, Rehana, you've started to touch on it, but let's just talk a little bit about how do you advance the narrative once you've arrived at understanding your donors and understanding your role in educating them on equity. How do you begin to advance the narrative?
Sure. I mean, it was one thing I'll say is that when you do this work and you do it in an inclusive way, it is not always fast. And when all of us are fundraising, we're like, we need our messages now. We got to get out there and start asking. And it takes time. We were really thoughtful about including grantees, staff board, other community partners in all of the interviews that we did with Mission Minded, so that we could have a really good sense of how people saw us, including the people that are really at the center of this work, which are the grantees that are doing the boots on the ground hard work in the community. So we we worked with all of those groups. And then, we did a really fun messaging exercise with our board at a board meeting that was incredibly helpful to kind of advance us to getting where we landed. We did the internal workshop with our staff. And so then also, I think that was really important to bring people along in the process as well, because, for example, where there was this kind of bristling of like, what are you talking about? Racial equity isn't our differentiator. If I had just taken that and then given something to people to say, this is what it is now, you have a bigger barrier to kind of get people to actually adopt that. Oh, wow. Yeah. Okay. I see where you're going with this. But by having more and more people involved in the work, then we were able to kind of more organically get people to see the process and be part of the process so that then they felt comfortable with where we landed with the messaging.
Yeah, it does. It takes a lot of work. It's seeding. And I think you did a especially great job at San Francisco Foundation of seeding all the different constituents, right? Your partners, your staff, your board, your grantees. I mean, we spoke to grantees, you spoke to your board at length. We brought your staff into this, some of your institutional partners. And so laying that groundwork early, I think yielded really helpful results. Let's share a little bit of what this work looked like. So just moving forward, Bonnie, if you will, here's based on sort of that strategy of urgency, emotion, and rationale. We used this theme to signify that we knew that it wasn't necessarily about the donors, but about what we can all achieve together. So really inviting them into this work in a way that really helped them see themselves as part of this and not the sort of benevolent savior that is making this happen. So the opportunity, and you can just move forward in these next 3 slides, Bonnie, really as an opportunity to invite them in a way that spoke more equitably and more collectively. The idea of collective power was a really important piece of this, and also understanding that we needed to all work together to achieve this greater goal. Rehana, let's go to the next slide. And do you want to just speak about sort of where you are at this point? Because I think it would be interesting for people, and Bonnie, you can advance to the next slide, to just hear a little bit more about where you are at this point in the campaign.
Sure. So we've started fundraising about a year ago, and we are in a quiet phase. The campaign is comprehensive, but we have a couple of areas that we're really targeting for growth, which is our annual operating fund, which we call the Bay Area Leads Fund. And again, that's really the money that enables us to do more of that policy and innovation work. And then also thinking about future discretionary bequests, because our future discretionary bequests enable us to do more grant making work, as well as supporting operations to do that policy work layered on. So we've raised we have commitments of about 20 million so far, which is, we're a large community foundation, but we really were never fundraising for ourselves before. So when I started, I think we were raising about $400,000 a year of annual operating support. This year we'll be at about 2.2 million, thanks to the campaign. So really seeing huge growth there. What we're learning is that it's taking a long time. Donors, it's taking multiple conversations for people to understand really what we're talking about when we talk about this systems change work. I think when we started, we thought more people would have an understanding of that, and that what the thing we needed to really connect with donors on was that the San Francisco Foundation is the place to come together to advance that work for the Bay. What we're seeing is that we need to spend more time talking with donors around, why, like what systems change means. A lot of our donors, they fund direct service more than they fund kind of policy. I understand that it's much more complicated. It also can feel very frustrating, right? It can feel more bureaucratic and less accessible. So we're really kind of the meeting donors where they are piece is really important. And so that is lots of one-on-one meetings. We do a series of Jeffersonian style dinners that have really engaged donors in the work at a different level, and encouraged really meaningful conversation that with grantees there as well, so that people can then kind of understand what we're talking about and see it in action. We've also, in addition to the case statement that you just saw images of, we've layered in some impact reports. We realized we needed to find some examples that were really good, direct examples of in addition to like, here was a problem, in addition to grant making, here's what we did to help, tackle that problem. And here was the result and how it impacts real people's lives. And, I think that's one of the challenges too, that we sometimes have. We can say, okay, we worked on this thing and we got this bill passed. Well, getting a bill passed to an individual donor doesn't really sound that exciting, right? Like they want to know, how did that impact somebody's life? And so we have to continue to work on creating these through lines of the storytelling so that donors can see where this is really shifting the needle for equity and inclusion in the Bay.
Great. You talked about a lot of things that are on this sort of wrap up slide that I want folks to take away. It's really understanding the values of your donors and how they align with yours. So that's that first point. The second point is that educating takes a while. That this is not easy work that we are doing, and it is not simple if then work. It's not a capital campaign with a building at the end of it. So we know that it takes a while to educate people about their role and yours in equity. And that once you do, you've created some great advocates, not just for the mission-driven work that you're doing, but for the sector at large. So those are the three things that we hope you will be able to do in your own work as you go forward. I want to open it now for questions because I know there have been quite a few. And again, thank you for those of you who are working in the chat and holding back until this time. But I'm going to ask my colleague Romaine to maybe just lob one or two of the questions to Rehana and I, so we have an opportunity to address those.
Yeah, thank you. There's actually a couple themes through a couple of the questions, and there's one that, or a couple that actually are two sides of a coin. So a great way for you to comment would be actually to comment on a couple of them together. The one side of the coin, if you will, is there's a couple of questions about people who are interested in the naming programs and spaces point that you mentioned about getting away from naming programs and spaces, and how you are helping organizations to help donors who want to create a lasting legacy. So on one side of the coin, there's the how do you do that for folks for whom that's important. And then on the other side of that coin is if you have donors who are among those that are historically disenfranchised, how do you account for that? And how does the organization not project that on those folks as part of their experience in their relationship?
Yeah, great. Rehana, you want to take a first stab? I have some thoughts too, but I want you to.
Sure. Regarding the naming piece, I think that there's a lot of ways that we can recognize and thank donors. I think the number of people that you alienate when you have names on the wall or list names by gift level is much greater than having the hard conversation with someone who is oftentimes, what I've found is that donors are just used to being given naming opportunities. They don't even really care. And like, I just did a campaign at the Oakland Museum of California that had a huge capital component to it. We ended up with two things that were related to naming, but they were in honor of someone. So it was a little bit different. And what I'm also finding is that like next generation philanthropists, so let's say people who are like Gen X and younger, they actually don't want their names on a wall. It's just not part of what they want to do. So I think that, and I will also say that it really can get you into trouble down the road. If you're going to do naming, you better make sure that you have some clauses in it about, when you go to do a renovation in 25 years, that name might not stick, or that if something happens with that donor's reputation, you have the ability to take the name down. So I think that there's a lot of complexities around it. And I think we just need to get creative around other ways that we can honor people's desire to leave a legacy. I mean, a huge part of the campaign we're doing right now at the San Francisco Foundation is about legacy giving. But, we're not doing a capital project. There's not physical spaces to name, but we really move away from the donor's name in lights as much as we possibly can. And then, I think the educate piece, one thing I was actually thinking as we were going through this, we have donors who are, as well-versed or better so in racial equity than many of our employees are, right? Like, so you can't make an assumption that all of your donors don't have any idea what you're talking about. And this is where it's really important that you meet people where you are. And I think also where they are, and also that you take people in partnership. So we have, for example, amazing board members at the San Francisco Foundation, and many of whom are part of the communities that we serve. And it was incredibly important to us that we have those voices in the work that we were doing to craft our messaging, so that it wasn't just about talking to people who might not be part of that community, but like the whole idea of collective power is really, as a collective, we're all bringing these different elements that together we can move towards the Bay Area that we all dream of. And we're never going to be able to do it just one of us or one segment of what makes up the Bay. So I think that's really important to, and including many different voices is a way that you can ensure that you're not kind of alienating one group over another.
Yeah, thank you. The other thing is, I'm thinking we're going to do a follow-up email with resources, and Rehana, you pointed out to me a great article in the Stanford Social Innovation Review about naming rights this month, and we'll include that link as well, because I think that'll really help people think more deeply about this. It's a hot topic, and we could do a whole webinar on that one. Let's do one more question, and then we'll do a wrap.
Yeah, I think there's another two questions that actually thread together nicely. They're about moving from a values-based audience donor persona to a more practical solicitation or designation of, which donor equals which persona. Rehana, I think this might be for you, is how do you move from that sort of more philosophical ideation of who your donors are to which individual fits which persona, if you do at all? And then even more nuts and bolts on that is then how do you work with other vendors to designate, for example, a mail house or some other vendors that are helping you do some of that identification solicitation work? How do you carry those ideas downstream into the actual solicitation communications?
Sure. So, I mean, for us, once we are, planning for a solicitation, I'm not mapping these personas to those individuals, because, anyone we're talking to for the campaign about a leadership or major gift, we have some level of relationship with. So we know that person as an individual. We've done our homework on that. We've spent time building that relationship. So it's really like a customized crafting. I think for us, where the persona work was super helpful was making sure that of the audiences that we felt we needed to engage in this campaign to be successful, we had messaging that was going to be meaningful to those different, like theoretical people. But once you get into the actual fundraising, it's much more the actual people. So we actually don't map in that way. In terms of like working with mail houses and vendors, so I'll say in my current role, our volume is not high enough to do that. So we don't do that. But in my previous roles, I did. And there's a really great framework that I'll mention, so there's this man, Marshall Gantz at the Harvard Kennedy School, who is an expert on creating movements. And then he actually worked for Obama when Obama did his first campaign, and it was, like the biggest grassroots fundraising effort we'd ever seen for a presidential campaign. And a lot of the work behind that was Marshall Gantz's work. And so he has created this framework of how to storytell that's called public narrative. And so it's the story of self, the story of us, and the story of now. You can Google it and find it. It's a really incredible framework. But I actually remember going to a training for this when I worked in a museum, and I decided to write our annual fund appeal through that framework of story of self, us, and now, versus like the way a mail house always wants you to write your annual appeal. And we raised twice as much money. And so so I'm such an advocate of pushing back. At the end of the day, the mail house is your vendor. So they need to do what you think is right for your organization. And I think that, when you are telling stories through a real lens of authenticity, and people can see how they can be part of movement and change, and that the kind of work many of us do, one of us isn't going to move the needle, but together, how much could we possibly do? And when you can get people to feel inspired in that way, the money moves more, for sure. Then, like, here's my outputs of how many visitors I had last year, and how many programs we offered. Like, those are just numbers. Those are outputs. They're not outcomes. And people want to feel like they're part of outcomes that really make a difference in people's lives.
Thanks, Rehana. I'm conscious of the fact that it's 1 minute until the end of the hour, and I hope that some of this has helped you all feel some of your collective power and that together we are moving the needle. Mission Minded is always here to help you with any and all of these services that you see here. And I want to just really thank Rehana for not just today, but for the opportunity to work with you at San Francisco Foundation and the Oakland Museum of California. And thank all of you for taking your coffee hour, your lunch hour, whatever it might have been to be with us this morning or this afternoon. Thanks again. We really, really appreciate your time.
Thank you.